Story number 1. The desert keeps every secret until the wind decides to move it. Some nights are so still that a memory can hear its own footsteps. If you stare long enough at a locked gate, you start to wonder who it keeps in. I learned that light doesn't always chase darkness away. Sometimes it points to where the darkness is waiting. And once you see a face that fear has frozen, you never stop looking for someplace warmer to live. Part 1. The Night That Drew a Map. 800 words. I was a night man, long before I had a home that felt like daylight. When I was a much younger man, I used to work as a security guard at a chemical plant down in my home country of Mexico. People imagine that nights stretch like an empty highway. They don't. They fold. They hold you. They ask plain questions. If you answer plainly, they let you pass. Some of the other guards used to say it creeped them out to hang around a closed-down factory at night. But I didn't mind it. I walked with a dented thermos, a cheap radio that favored stations no one requested, and a flashlight that could touch the far fence if I held my breath just right. The back lot had its own weather. Condensation clung to pipework like a thin skin. The metallic sweetness of solvents rode the air, and the gravel learned my boots the way a dog learns a whistle. I counted steps between lampposts until the numbers came easier than my birthday. Foxes slipped between shadow and light. Vagrant dogs studied me with the old patience of judges. I kept my hands visible, my voice low, as if I were a guest in a chapel that had lost its stained glass, but still remembered the hymns. The front entrance was a mouth with a metal tooth. One of the bar gates on the plant's front entrance suffered a minor malfunction. In the maintenance log, I wrote, "Latch sticks under pressure." In the privacy of my head, I wrote, "Someone will hear about this and try," meaning a person could just stop, get out, and lift up the bar before a second person drove the car right through into the plant. You don't need prophecy when you have bad engineering and a town full of teenagers who want a place away from fathers who swing hammers at problems that ask for hands. The first time I caught them, steam still rose off the cooling tanks. A dusty sedan idled behind the capacitor sheds. The first time I saw a car parked around the back of the plant. I shined my flashlight at it, and it took off toward the front gate, with windows fogged by two hearts doing their best to become one. I jogged after it, certain they'd have to stop and wrestle with the faulty bar. But I wasn't fast enough, and they got away. Later, I found a paper napkin crushed into gravel and a small tube of lip gloss glinting like a tiny beacon. I pocketed neither. Evidence of tenderness has a right to rot in peace. After that, word must have traveled faster than my patrols. I learned to clear my throat from 20 paces, learned the little sweep of my flashlight, that meant go find another shadow. Most nights, it worked. The cars would disappear like magic. I played illusionist for kids who feared small-town rumors more than police reports. Then I met the knight that would not be persuaded. But then came the time when my magic trick didn't work, and when I shined my flashlight on a trespassing car, it didn't move. I spoke the way a gentle groom speaks to a nervous horse. "You don't have to go home," I said. "But you can't stay here." No engine answered. The radio in my pocket spoke to no one. I came closer, reading shapes, 2 heads, one tilted, one forward. The halo of a street lamp turned the windshield into thin ice. At the passenger door, I said, louder, that I was talking to them. What I saw next wrote itself into the bones behind my face. The kids inside that old car couldn't hear a word I was saying because both of them were dead. The boy had been kept sitting by something cruel and tidy. The boy in the driver's seat was only sitting upright because the wire he'd been strangled with was tied to the headrest. A faint, dark ring had settled where a necklace would sit. His face and hands looked bright blue in the beam of my flashlight. The girl next to him looked like she'd been stabbed in the side of the neck, and a brown fan had dried across her blouse and the center console. Their eyes, hers half closed, as if sleep had made a last promise. His widened, as if the sky had arrived too late. I didn't remember crossing the lot, only the office door under my palm, cool and unforgiving. I called the cops. While I waited, I steadied my breath and made promises I could keep. I would not look away from their faces. I would not invent a story to make myself cleaner. The first cruiser turned the gravel into a stage. By the time my shift ended, the back of the plant surrounding the car was a crime scene with tape strung like a border and boots printing new constellations no one would want to name. The man coming to relieve me asked if I was all right. I told him I just needed a day to forget. It was bravado. Forgetting is a country I can't cross. That night poured itself into every step I took afterward. I patrolled with a second shadow. I paused by the empty spot the way a tongue seeks the memory of a broken tooth. I was truly haunted by what I saw that night. Guilt whispered strategies that would never find a culprit. In the end, I did the simplest thing a man can do when a place will not let him breathe. I left. Then, about a year later, I moved to Arizona with my heavily pregnant wife. We drove north with a crib disassembled in the back and a hope too big to strap down. Arizona was heat revised into light. While all kinds of terrible stuff happens on this side of the border. 2. I learned that some nights there, the stars look like nails holding up a pitch-black roof. And some mornings, the sun undoes every knot you tied in the dark. I found another gate, another booth, a new map of hours, and told myself, belief doesn't clean memory. It gives it a chair. Part 2. The desert has ears. 800 words. Tucson taught me distance. During monsoon, the horizon traded its spine for shoulders. Between lightning and the far roll of sky, you could count how long it takes for a warning to arrive. On shift, I learned faces by the way they kept secrets. A woman who slept in her car asked if our lot was safer than the street. I gave her a corner the cameras didn't love and the security blanket of a promise made by a stranger who understood nights. A groundskeeper swapped me a burrito for silence about a six-pack he shouldn't have had. Harmless trespasses are still trespasses. I know. Mercy is also a policy if you dare to write it. At home, my wife spoke to our son as if every word could hammer his bones into kindness. On Saturday mornings, I took him out to feel the wind, and he blinked as if the world introduced itself by brushing his eyelashes. I built a story I could stand inside. I would be a quiet man, keep a clean ledger, teach my boy the geometry of trust, how straight lines sometimes require a bend to get around a wound. The new plant had a smarter brain than the old one, but even smart machines can feel haunted. At 03:11, one night, a sensor tripped with no car present. A pale icon blinked on my screen, like a heartbeat drawn wrong. I logged it. False positive? The next night, it did the same. On the 3rd, I went out. The desert's cold is clean. It makes a man articulate. I swept my light across empty bays and quiet fences. The chain link sang its loose tune. Somewhere a night bird practiced patience. I told myself the desert was being the desert. The censor disagreed. The message came 2 nights later from a number I didn't know. You were always going to lift the bar. I looked around for a prankster with time to waste, for a coworker who believed jokes could save a life. I found none. I deleted the message and memorized it anyway. The way a soldier remembers a path he will never walk again. A week after that, I found 2 ribbons tied to the fence, one red, one blue. They shook in the breath of my flashlight like a siren that had decided to stand still. I didn't touch them. We carry too much across borders, as it is. I wrote the sighting in a notebook I kept for truths that didn't belong in company email. In the same notebook, I listed the things I had refused to learn from Mexico. Names of the kids who came to kiss. The patience to stand closer and speak softer. The courage to be more than a moving spotlight. It seems odd to think that seeing something so terrible was the start of my journey to the U.S. But I will not pretend. That night was the ancestor of every decision I made after it. It took me north and made me choose what kind of father to be, what kind of man to become under a sky with fewer clouds and no excuses. Sometimes, when the air was very still, I heard footsteps that weren't mine, I would turn, and a shadow would be turning too, as if the night had learned my shape and wanted to try it on. I learned not to chase it. Not everything that follows you means harm. Some things simply want company, proof they aren't the only ones awake. On my lunch breaks, I drove to the east edge of town, where the ground rises into low, patient hills. From there, the city looks like it is listening. I would think about the two who never got old, about the ugly elegance of a wire tied to a headrest, about a girl who leaned into a sleep that did not invite her. I imagined 100 better ways the world might have spent them. A small apartment with stubborn plants on the windowsill, arguments about rent that end in laughter, a child whose eyes learned to forgive. Imagination is not redemption. It is, however, a living room where grief can sit without being handed a bill. Part 3. The bar lifts. 800 words. On the first anniversary of that night, I took flowers I could afford to a cemetery that wasn't theirs and said their names to a stone that didn't answer. The sun moved like it was late for a promise, and the shade under a mesquite made a small room I didn't deserve. I promised to tell my son about them. No details, only the lesson. Do not mistake a silent place for a safe one. That evening began with a broken coffee machine and a note from the day supervisor. Gate 2. Maintenance tomorrow. I smiled without humor. Gates don't keep danger out. They give it a number you can put on a report. I walked the perimeter. Coyotes stitched cursive on the dust. A man on a bicycle haunted the fence line, pedaling after a better version of himself. I let him go. Mercy, even small, keeps the hinges from rusting. At 03:11, the icon blinked again. This time, I didn't radio dispatch. I walked out slow enough to hear the ground complain under my boots. Gate 2 waited like a patient animal. The lock sat correct. The latch behaved. The bar lay obedient. Then, with no hand on it, the bar rose the width of a finger and settled back. I stood very still. Stillness is a language the desert will teach you if you stay long enough. The bar rose again, higher than all the way up, the way a breath becomes a decision. I should have run diagnostics, should have woken maintenance, should have collected witnesses like signatures. Instead, I stepped through. On the other side, the air tasted colder, as if every border made its own weather. 10 paces in, I heard another set of steps matching mine. I turned the light. The beam showed my breath and the glitter of a bottle someone had abandoned months ago. Just beyond the honest reach of the light, glass held a late memory. 2 faces. Not in detail, not in color, not like the polished cruelty of a photograph, only the argument of 2 lives with the dark, suspended in a sheen that receded when I dared to blink. Tell me what I should have done, I said to the air. The lot did not offer an opinion. That is the trouble with places. They keep your secrets. They also keep your questions. So I answered for it. I should have walked up sooner that night in Mexico. I should have used my voice like a man uses a hand, to soothe, to interrupt harm, to insist on dignity. I should have learned names and sketched a kinder map for young hearts than a yard meant for solvents and sorrow. When I finished the speech, I owed to the unburied part of myself. The bar lowered. I stood on the wrong side and waited to feel wrong. No alarm scolded me. No camera complained. The screen in the booth stopped blinking, polite as a door held open. In my notebook, I wrote, "Tonight the gate lifted itself." Under that, I added, "Forgiveness is not proof of innocence, but I will accept it before sunrise." I drove again to the hills. The city exhaled. A pale wash of light spread like a careful promise. I thought about the guard who relieved me that night long ago, the one who carried only my story and not the stain of what I saw. I wondered who took my place after I left, whether he counted lamp posts the way I did, whether a stray dog still warmed the spot where the car had been, as if keeping a place for a truth that wouldn't come back at home. My son stirred. I held him and felt the small insistence of his pulse against my forearm. I told him a bedtime story at dawn. Somewhere, a gate lifted itself and a man walked through. He didn't find ghosts. He found the version of himself that knew what mercy costs and paid it. He came back with nothing in his hands and more in his chest. There is no evil from which good does not come. My abuelita said that, and I kept the sentence like a stubborn coin, smoothing it in my pocket until it shone without edges. The coin doesn't erase the bill. It doesn't balance the ledger, but it helps a man make change when the day demands it. Tonight, I'll go to work with 2 notebooks. In the first, I will write the routines so that men who sleep in daylight will believe the world is simple. In the second, I will write what the night says when it trusts me not to laugh at it. If a gate lifts, I will step through, not to hunt or to be hunted, but to measure the distance between who I was and who the dark is still teaching me to be. Story number 2. I kept telling myself it was temporary. The way a fever tells you it will break if you just last the night. I believed skill could outpace luck, until luck changed its shirt and came back as debt. I thought the office would save me, as if fluorescent light could bleach away a side hustle's stain. I rehearsed every answer for the day authorities might arrive, and opened my door to something worse. I used to measure risk in basis points. That night, I measured it in breaths, counting each one like it might be my last. I was a market orphan after the crash, the kind who learned to live off lists, job boards, applications, promises that never called back. I learned the shape of late fees and the sound of my own excuses. A friend from school, Darren, still picked up when I rang. He had a steady job and a habit he wore like a jacket. There, but not his whole identity. I envied that balance, the way he could close the spreadsheet of the day and open a different life. We met up, and I asked questions no decent person asks as a first favor. Quantity, price, supply lines. I didn't want smoke. I wanted margin. He stared like I'd sprouted antlers, then listened while I sketched the cliff. My savings were tumbling down. He made a call. A number arrived in my contacts like a secret door. I built a tiny clientele out of faces I recognized, Darren and his circle. My rules were monastic. Only people I knew. Only small amounts. Only until I got back on payroll. Rules shift when spreadsheets do. A few extra mouths turned into a ledger that smiled. By the time my customer base hit double figures, bills that had gnawed through envelopes backed away. I kept my appointments at the job center, wore contrition like a suit, and told the mirror I was almost done. Then a desk found me again. Lower pay, longer probation. But a chair is a church when you've been kneeling on concrete. I should have deleted the dealer's number when my first payslip arrived. I held my phone over the bin like a convert about to renounce an idol, and failed. The money was frictionless, the effort a whisper. I told myself I'd stop next month, then told myself I'd stop when probation ended, then told myself I'd stop when temptation learned my address. Temptation didn't need directions. It had a key. That Wednesday, I fell asleep with a calendar open in my head, sorting Fridays from fears. I woke to the house pressing a finger to my lips. The clock cut the dark with its humble verdict. 2, 3. Something struck my front door, once and again, harder, insisting. I climbed the stairs' pause at the landing and listened. Police open up the door. I had rehearsed this exact moment 100 times, each run through a chess game with myself. I boasted of hiding places I'd invented like magic tricks, in baseboards, in a gutted lamp, beneath a layer of off-brand cereal. Belief is a costume fear wears when it wants to go out. My feet carried me down. My hand touched the locks. A voice outside said it again. That phrase I feared and prepared for. Like a prophecy I wanted to beat on a technicality. I opened. Night entered, wearing other faces. Men in masks holding tools as weapons. The vestibule narrowed to a blade. I tried slamming the door, but a boot was already in it. A decision I hadn't made arrived before me. The door surrendered. The house became a mouth, and I was the food. They moved with practiced certainty, dividing rooms the way you divide a victim's hope into smaller parts. The one who had spoken, he was not the law, but he spoke like it, told me in no uncertain terms that I could cooperate or I could become a lesson. A wrench hovered. A hammer waited like punctuation at the end of a sentence I refused to finish. He dragged me by the hair toward the front room. A coil of blue cord appeared from a hoodie pocket. A cheap, ordinary thing with a terrible job to do. They tied my wrists behind me until my shoulders begged for a different body. Ankles, knees. They pushed me onto the couch, a throne of someone else's evening. Now a dock for trial without law. I offered the script I thought robbers want. Take whatever. Leave me unbroken. The reply came in questions that knew their own answers. Where did I hide it? How many spots? How much cash? How much stock? I lied like a child. Badly. Obviously. Pain arrived to translate my denial into a language my nerves could speak. A weight found my shins, then my thighs, then my calves. A hand was pressed over my mouth to keep the truth inside, or maybe to keep the neighbor's curiosity asleep. I swallowed my pride and tasted dust. I told myself I could outlast their attention, that the clock would gift me dawn if I made it through a few more minutes, and they offered a different metric. A pair of pliers flashed, a promise rather than a threat. A cold pressure touched my toe, and the world's map shrank. The borders of everything I'd been disappeared until it was only me and an edge. I crossed to survival. I told them the places. The lamp that wasn't a lamp anymore. The shelf lip that gave if you pressed with 2 fingers, and faith. The sealed cereal box with oats on top and other harvest beneath. I told them about the cash, the ounce bags of weed upstairs, the inventory I never called by name in daylight. They split, some to watch me, some to reap. In the silence between footsteps, I became someone I didn't want to meet again. Upstairs, drawers spoke in the language of disturbance. Then, found it. The words were colder than the tools. A figure returned, hands decorated with my discipline. The leader nodded, satisfied like a manager doing end of day. He told the others to go. Then he turned toward me and gave an order I was built to misunderstand. Put him to sleep. He didn't mean forever. He meant now. A fist carried out the command. My jaw became a tuning fork for consequence. The room lost its edges, and I misplaced the thread. When the ites of pain knit back into a me, the house was a museum after closing. Everything in place except the feeling. My memory wore a hole where the ropes were, so when I tried to move, truth returned in a flood. Panic arrived with its grab bag of suggestions. Scream, wiggle, bargain with furniture. The ties tightened with every struggle, carving little signatures into my wrists. The phone sat on the coffee table like a small god I hadn't paid tribute to. I launched myself, a kind of swim that ended on the rug. I knocked the handset down and heard mercy in the dial tone. There were only a few numbers my memory carried without help. Family would panic, friends would judge, authorities would ask questions my house wasn't clean enough to answer. So I called the one person who understood what had been taken in both meanings of the word. He answered like a man halfway between dreams. I told him the situation. He said he had his kid with him. I told him again, with fewer words and more truth. He told me to wait and not make noise. The wait had a length, about half an hour, and a shape, my breath at the window, my heart in the hall. He came the way caution comes, indirect, through the garden. The relief I felt when his silhouette crossed the glass could have powered a city. He used the spare key I'd told him about. He cut the cords with the gentle hurry of a parent who has done this before in other forms. Seat belts, kite string, the sticky tape of a toy's packaging. He looked at me like I'd just escaped a wreck and was running on instinct alone. He told me I was lucky, then sold me stories I would have paid not to hear. Men confessed to by scars and limps, intimate testimonials of punishment. What now? I asked, tasting copper and a lesson. I can't call the police. Can I? He shrugged the way street wisdom shrugs. Move into the other side of the city if possible, because once they found you, they always come back. Advice is a door. Sometimes it's also a deadline. I moved. Contracts can be broken if you are willing to be broke. I packed what I was willing to keep, which turned out to be less than I owned and more than I deserved. The landlord cried policy. I cried urgency. Paperwork bled me, and I let it. I finally stopped selling. Not out of principle, but out of clarity. I had been playing at risk, as if it were a game that ends when you want it to. I had told myself I could keep my hands clean, while my pockets held what I wouldn't say. That night showed me what business I had been in. Not product, not profit, but proximity. To men who make pain into a tool, and to choices that teach you their price only after you have paid in advance. I keep odd relics now. The old clock that told the truth too plainly. A cheap coil of blue plastic I can't touch. A door frame with a ghost of a dent in it. I visit them the way a believer visits a shrine, to remind myself what worship never to offer again. Some days, memory volunteers the phrase that woke me, the one I feared, the one I prepared for. Police, open up the door. It never was the police. It was the bill. Arriving at the address I had given it, I wanted a shortcut back to myself, and found a tunnel that made me someone else. I wanted to win time and discovered time doesn't gamble. It only collects. I wanted to keep control and learned that control keeps itself. So I wanted a story with a clean lesson. The lesson was that there aren't any. I wanted to live like nothing bad could find me. Bad things keep a map. I sleep lightly now. I carry a smaller life on purpose. The kind that doesn't tempt anyone to come take it. When the house makes night noises, I let them be. Locks still turn. I sometimes wonder if I'd stopped right then and there. I'd have avoided what was coming. But wondering is just a different kind of keeping. The men who came to my door taught me the oldest math. Subtraction comes first. The miracle is that I'm still here to add anything up at all. Story number 3. I woke to a house that had taught me to trust it. And for the first time, it felt like it might not deserve that trust. I stood in darkness, counting the breaths of the people I loved, and listening to the life of the house answer back with unfamiliar movements. I told myself I was still the careful man I'd been in the city. But comfort is a soft liar, and quiet streets make brave assumptions. At the bottom of the stairs waited a lesson I never wanted, a lesson that still returns when my daughter's porch light cuts across the kitchen tile in the small hours. By dawn, the police would have my statement. But the truth is, that night never ended. It just learned how to look like morning. We had moved out of our apartment and into what we called our starter home. It felt like a promise we could hold in our hands. A narrow 2-bedroom with pale siding and a small maple that bowed toward the sidewalk as if greeting us by name. The town line ran like an invisible seam behind our back fence. City on one side, suburb on the other. It was a 2-bedroom townhouse right on the boundary between the city and the suburbs. The kind of place realtors describe as transitional, as if a neighborhood could clear its throat and become something gentler. We were in love with it from the moment we attended viewing. I assembled a crib in the smaller room with an anxiety that felt almost ceremonial, and my wife taped paper stars above the window, a galaxy temporary, but entirely ours. For months, the street instructed us in a softer routine. The trash truck came at the same time. The dog walkers came later. It was serene compared to the neighborhood of our old apartment, where every night demanded vigilance, where locks were promises and also prayers. After a few months of living there, I slowly started to let my guard down. I told myself this was progress rather than neglect. I still kept all the doors locked at night, and I still kept my gun ready to go in its lockbox, a concession to habit more than fear. My wife said sleep tasted different there. Our daughter's laughter seemed bigger, as if quiet gave it room to stand up straight. Then came the night that taught me what quiet can hide. Imagine the terror that I felt when I woke up in the middle of the night in our peaceful new neighborhood and heard noises coming from downstairs. I lay there, inventorying everything. The weight of my wife's arm against the blanket, the tiny rhythmic breath from the crib. My wife was asleep next to me, and our daughter was in her crib, just a few feet away from our bed. That made the math easier, and much worse. If familiar bodies were accounted for, then unfamiliar feet were moving below. This is the part of the story where I am supposed to be a certain kind of man. I can pretend I always knew what to do. But the truth is a human thing, not a legend. I woke up my wife, told her what was going on, and then told her to call the cops while I made sure the home invader didn't make it upstairs. It was a plan assembled from movies, advice from neighbors, and the tired courage of fathers. Then I made for my closet, grabbed my gun from the lockbox, and felt how heavy decisions can be when they advertise their consequences in your hand. In the hallway, the carpet cooled my feet, and reality narrowed into measurable tasks. Step, breath, listen. I had rehearsed scenarios in my head, imagined doors kicked, imagined speeches delivered in steady voices. Looking back on it, I can remember the exact point I changed my mind on what I was going to do. I knew that I didn't want to kill anybody, because no matter the circumstances, I didn't want that on my conscience. But I also knew my first name was now spelled with other letters: husband, father, and both demanded I hold a line. I made up my mind to try and surprise them, and then keep them where they were under pain of death till the cops showed up and arrested them. The stairs insisted I choose each board like a word in a sentence I could not take back. Once I was maybe 2/3 of the way down the stairs, I heard noises coming from our kitchen. Not the living room, where the TV and speakers waited. Not the office, where a laptop kept a chorus of family photos behind a screensaver. When I heard sounds from the kitchen, I realized that I'd have to creep all the way down the first floor corridor without alerting whoever was there. The air smelled faintly of coffee grounds from dinner and the sweetness of the cereal my daughter loved. I followed that sweetness the way sailors once followed stars. I froze when I heard the faint sound of a chair leg scraping against the linoleum floor, and the cabinets returned their own halting rhythm. Open, pause, close, pause. A map of someone learning a house by touch. I peeked around the kitchen doorway. I had imagined the height of a man, the angle of shoulders in shadow. I had my gun ready and was about to tear around that area like I was in a movie shouting freeze. But the house had other plans for the role I was going to play. There was light enough from the window to write a different sentence. It wasn't some 6-foot jailbird armed to the teeth. It was a little kid, bare chest, wearing what looked like shorts, standing on a chair with one knee pressed against the cabinet for balance. He worked the shelf with the desperate expertise of someone who has memorized the map to survival. I watched him stuffing the pocket of his shorts with candy and chocolate bars. His ribs were a ledger of hunger. The bravado I had borrowed scattered like dust in the light. My anger dissolved into something heavier. I didn't want to frighten him, not only because a fall would write a tragedy on the edge of our table, but because fear had already carved enough into him. It occurred to me to just switch on the kitchen light. I pressed the switch. The second I did, the kid's head spun around to look at me, and he just froze, looking at me. I lowered the muzzle to the floor and widened my hands around it, like a parent introducing a difficult topic. "It's okay. It's okay, buddy," I said, and asked him softly if he was hungry. He did not answer. He watched me the way a field animal watches a fence. I tried to offer a smile that meant safety rather than bargain. Once I got a good look at the kid, that smile was wiped from my face. He was barefoot, his hair cut short like a recent buzz, and his chest and arms were a field of small scars. Some were the size and shape of nothing I wanted to imagine too closely. There were a lot of them, maybe 24. On his face, neck, and right arm were small black symbols. That poor kid had been tattooed. I searched for a name to offer him, because names make bridges. But he gave me silence, and the silence was eloquent. I asked the kid what his name was, trying to get him talking and calm him down. But he didn't talk, not once. He got down off the chair, very slow, with his pocket stuffed with candy, and then stood very still and stared at me. I asked him if he'd run away from home. He would not grant me a word, but he did grant me a glance. His eyes darted over to our pantry and the back door beyond. My mind staged a new danger. Maybe he was not alone. I jumped back from the kitchen doorway and raised my gun towards the pantry, anticipating the worst architecture of a man who could do that to a child. The doorway offered nothing but a paint smell and a sense that the house itself was holding its breath. The only thing I saw was the kid go running into the pantry. I followed as far as the threshold. Then the story changed shape again. The last I saw of the kid was his feet wriggling through the doggy door. The flap lifted, and then the yard took him, and then the night took the yard. We had kept the small door when we moved in, an invitation to a future dog we promised our daughter. That night, it was an exit sign for a child I could not save in the manner I wanted to. I stood there cataloging the details as if the right arrangement would become a clue. The empty chair, the candy in his pocket, the sharp smell of the permanent marker used for symbols that did not belong on skin. After taking a few seconds to process everything, I called the cops to tell them what happened. Not to report a theft. I called because I saw a kid who had been subjected to some horrific physical abuse. He needed to be found, and he needed to be rescued. My wife came down when I told her the house had steadied. She made coffee with hands that shook only a little. We sat without talking, letting the steam do the speaking adults do when children are sleeping. 2 uniformed cops stopped by about an hour later, and I told them everything I could about the kid's appearance and how he'd acted. They listened the way professionals learn to listen, eyes on you, but mind building a map of streets and porches and yards. They asked about neighbors. I hadn't met anyone who set off any alarm bells. One cop said what I already suspected. If a child was slipping through pet doors at night to find sugar, then starvation, or something like it, was the wolf at his heels. I signed the statement with a hand that finally understood what weight it had been carrying. The officers promised to canvass, to ask quiet questions, to bring a photo to the shelter where someone might have seen those symbols before. I wished the cops a ton of luck. Luck is a small tool, but sometimes it is the only one within reach. Years do not pass so much as they learn to disguise themselves as other years. My daughter grew into different bedrooms and different hairstyles, and a laugh that could salt a wound closed. We did get a dog, a patient animal who loved that little door more than anyone. The maple by the sidewalk climbed a little higher. Houses change us without asking. So do nights. More than 20 years later, there's not a day that goes by that I'm not reminded of him in some way. You would think the memory would fade with all that sunlight, but some stories are not shadows. They are colors that deepen in the winters that followed. I drove past blocks where curtains drew back at the sound of tires on ice, and wondered whether someone inside needed a safe kitchen and a warm light and a voice that said a simple thing like, "It's okay." In summers, when sprinklers gave the lawns their brief miracles, I thought of symbols on a child's skin and how a body can become a passport stamped by someone else's cruelty. My daughter learned to ride a bike, and I ran behind her, palms open, not touching, ready to catch. That is all I have ever wanted to be, a set of open hands. Some nights I still wake at the same hour I woke then. I sit at the top of the stairs with the lights off and listen to the safe noises of a house that earned its reputation back. A dishwasher completing a cycle. The refrigerator deciding its work is done. The dog adjusting to a dream of forests. I tell the quiet what I should have told the boy if I'd had more time. There are places where you can be fed without paying with your skin. There are people whose hands add rather than subtract. And if he ever returns to a kitchen in the dark, I hope the first light he finds is gentler than mine, and the first face holds only welcome. I was asked once what I would have done differently. The question came years later from a friend who collects hypotheticals like rare bottles. I told him I would have put down the gun sooner, that I would have said the word safe before any other word, that I would have offered milk instead of a sentence about the police. He asked whether I worried I had let a criminal escape. I said I had watched a child leave through a door meant for dogs, and if that was a crime, I wanted no part in solving it with force. Some stories ask for heroes and get instead witnesses, but there is a dignity in witness, if you let it. I still keep the lockbox, though old habits are not the enemy. Fear is. The box stays because responsibility can live beside mercy. The maple out front keeps growing because roots learn what roofs cannot teach. When the porch light strikes the kitchen at night, I sometimes set a small plate on the counter, an orange, a granola bar, a bottle of water. It is a ritual with no congregation and a prayer with no theology. If you asked why, I would say this: somewhere a child is measuring a night by cupboards and quiet doors. Somewhere a hand reaches for a switch, and a voice needs to say a simple thing and mean it. It's okay. It's okay. Buddy, story number 4. The first time I saw the street empty, I thought I was safe. The second time, I realized the emptiness was staring back. The third time, something moved where nothing should move. By the fourth, the night explained that the noise wasn't a quarrel, but a rehearsal. By the fifth, I understood the room wanted me to listen. I study in a cramped room with a stubborn sash window that refuses to seal unless I bargain with it. On warm nights, I leave it ajar. The frame scrapes, my palms burn, and I promise myself I'll fix it when the semester eases. That night, heat pooled between buildings and drifted in from the parking lot like a held breath. I measured time by the soft blink of my router and the rectangle of my phone face down on the desk. I didn't want a story. I wanted sleep, and the kind of silence you can fold around yourself and pretend is safety. Outside, a conversation braided itself too close to my wall. It wasn't super loud or anything, but it was literally right there outside my window. The voices moved in tight circles, mostly in very hushed tones, the way people talk when they want to be hidden and heard at the same time. A boy, a girl, not strangers to each other, and not anything healthy. I stayed still and told myself to ignore them. Then my hand was already at the curtain, 2 fingers parting the cloth like a stagehand peeking from the wing. The street lights missed them by a few steps, smearing their outlines instead of naming them. The boy kept his back to me like a locked door. The girl's face turned just enough to flash cheekbone and a clip of light in her hair. They argued in loops that made my stomach feel like an unfastened belt. Pull, slack, pull. He leaned toward her, a posture that meant pleading and pressure at once. She answered with a steadiness that felt honed by practice. At first, I thought they were a couple, and then I realized that they were an ex-couple, orbiting the same broken planet. The words that reached me were not the content, only the temperature. I hate you. You disgust me. The rest was frost on glass. I told myself it was none of my business. I told myself I had morning lectures. I told myself a dozen polite lies that felt like civility and were, in fact, cowardice dressed for bed. I watched, anyway. I always watch when I should look away. When you swear you won't get involved. You construct a small fence and pray no one falls on your side. The boy pivoted as if to leave, the movement of someone rehearsing a better choice, and then wheeled around as if his body had decided not to wait for consent. He lifted his arm and put his fist where a face was. I don't have to engrave the exact geometry of it. The room did that for me. Her knees lost their argument with gravity. She folded and met the ground in a way that made my jaw ache in sympathy. A sound followed. Animal. Brief. The body's primitive vote for survival. I didn't think. I climbed up on my toes and put my mouth to the frame of the window as if it were a microphone. Hey, leave her alone. You piece of crap. The boy pulled up, startled by the fact of being seen. It happens like that. People remember witnesses exist only when the air itself points at them. He fled toward a car with the skittering urgency of someone who only knows how to exit. He started running off toward his car and then took off driving, while the street lights drew pale bands across his windshield. Doors opened along my hall. Feet pounded. We spilled down the stairwell without choreography and found the girl on the asphalt. One hand clawed toward her throat. The other curled under her shoulder like a broken wing folded to hide the damage. Someone whispered a diagnosis. Someone else called campus safety, and then 911. I slid my palms beneath her head so the concrete wouldn't take more from her, terrified that if I failed that one small job, I'd be telling this story with a different ending. Her muscles jerked in involuntary tides, some kind of seizure, and all of us learned in the same minute how long a minute can be. Sirens arrived in their own time. The paramedics did not waste words. They made a quick ring of space around her and lifted her into a soft blue pocket of light. We stood there with our useless hands and watched the night swallow the back end of the ambulance. None of us went back to bed right away. We wandered the lot, pretending to look for evidence, actually hunting for the scrap of reassurance that we had done enough. Thankfully, the girl survived with just a concussion, and her ex-boyfriend ended up getting arrested. That sentence would be a mercy if it were the whole story. It wasn't. Sleep didn't return to the building. It certainly didn't return to me. The open window auditioned every sound from the street. What kept replaying wasn't the strike. It was the small sound afterward. The one that proved the body keeps living before the mind catches up. I heard it in the shower spray, under the clink of dishes, inside the hum of the lecture hall projector. The gossip did its usual work. Names, secrets, a rumor about what he had hidden and how long she had known. He kept apologizing for something he hadn't told her, and by then, everyone pretended they had always suspected. I started closing the window, and the room turned to soup. Heat draped itself over my shoulders. The fan moved air like a slow spoon. On the fourth night, I woke because the curtain touched my cheek as if a hand had tested the distance. The latch I had forced down was now up by the width of a fingernail. In the dust of the sill were 2 crescent smears, like the marks made by someone trying not to leave marks. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself a draft had learned to pick locks. At 03:17, the router blink pattern hiccuped. At 03:23, the time that would later lodge in me like a thorn, the curtain breathed again. The window lifted with a careful patience, as if the night had hands and manners. I sat upright and listened with my entire skin. The parking lot looked empty, but I could hear footsteps that weren't footsteps, the memory of impact pacing in a circle, wearing a path in the dark. I said, quietly, that I was still here. I said it for her, and maybe for me. The room made itself my accomplice. The floorboards kept the neighbor's tread quiet. The thin walls stopped being thin. Even the garden outside, the little strip of soil that always grows trash instead of flowers, seemed to lean in. I thought of the boy's posture, not the punch, but the way he had rehearsed leaving before choosing the other thing. I thought of all the times people decide 5 seconds too late to be good. The next morning, I removed the window track with a screwdriver and found, buried in gray grit and a rumor of rust, a small square of shattered phone glass, a glittering scale the size of my thumbnail. I remembered my phone face down on the desk and felt a stupid wave of shame at the things we perform for no one. I pressed the shard into my palm until I almost drew blood, then slid it into a zip bag and tucked it in my drawer, like evidence you're not ready to give away. That evening, I printed a list: campus safety, the non-emergency number, the desk of our RA, and 2 friends with cars who answer on the first ring. I taped the list to the inside of the frame where only I could read it when the window was up. I sent a message to the floor group chat about bystander plans. Who calls? Who blocks a car with their body angled wide? Who pulls neighbors from doors? The replies came back fast, full of the kind of courage people keep hidden until someone names it. We decided that if cruelty tried to rehearse again under our light, it would find an audience that knew how to interrupt. I don't know whether the boy ever learned what ashamed feels like in the bone. I don't know whether the girl heard my shout, or if the world had narrowed to a tunnel with one exit. I know only this: the room and I keep watch. Nights are warm again, and the window still sticks, and I have not fixed it on purpose. I want the resistance. I want the reminder that safety is something you make with your hands. When the curtain brushes my face, I'm not afraid of the dark shape it sketches on the wall. I'm afraid of silence, pretending to be neutrality. So I keep the list taped, the screwdriver on the desk, and the habit of listening sharpened to a narrow point. It was a warm night. I kept my window open. I woke up. They argued. The boy turned back and punched the girl in the face. Fellow students came running. She survived with a concussion. He was arrested. What remains is not an anecdote. It's a practice. I will not let the night decide what happens under my window again. Story number 5. I never feared the dark until the night it finally did what daylight never managed. It hid a stranger in my house. I always thought the danger lived out on the pavement, where voices carry and footsteps announce themselves. That night proved the opposite. It arrived barefoot, quiet, and already inside. You don't realize how loud your own pulse can sound until the room offers nothing else back. In true blackout darkness, your heartbeat becomes the only ticking clock. I used to claim that I hated curtains because they strangled the air. That was true, until I realized air flows both ways. There's a kind of courage that is just theater. Mine had to be good enough to convince an unseen audience I couldn't even look in the eye. I live on the ground floor of a modest house at the end of a cul-de-sac, where hedges keep the gossip out, and hedgehogs consider the garden path their own personal corridor. The left and right windows open from the bottom. Summer has been overstaying its welcome in my slice of the UK. And when the heat lingers, a person will do nearly anything for a stray draft. This means when it's unpleasantly hot, which is a lot of the time in the UK lately. There's basically an opening in my room at a height that someone could simply step over and into the room. The calculation always felt sensible to me. I'm a night worker. Sleep comes at noon, like a stubborn guest. So who would dare step into an occupied room in broad daylight? This isn't normally a problem because I work nights, so I'd only be asleep in the room in the middle of the day. I also loved a room that breathed. I don't have curtains hung on these windows. The street can't see in because the front garden, an overachieving green barricade, swallows most of the view. When the frames were updated, I convinced myself I could live curtainless. I hate having the air into the room blocked, and I hate blocking out the natural light. When exhaustion wins, I don a mask like a traveling actor and let the sun perform elsewhere. When I sleep in the daytime, I use a sleep mask, so I just didn't need curtains for years. A street lamp outside performed a gentle amber dusk over the garden, and I slept with its glow like a tame campfire beyond the glass. Then the council swapped it for something colder, clinical, indifferent to the birds and the blooms. What used to be a warm orange glow was replaced by a harsh spotlight, white, that completely illuminates my entire front garden and shines essentially a floodlight in through my window. They promised shields for the back of those fixtures, some guard that would funnel the glare down rather than into living rooms. They're supposed to fit these street lights out with rear guards to prevent light pollution of personal property, but they just haven't. So I made a compromise with light. I bought a canvas printed fold-out screen, and it seemed like a perfect option. I could move it like a prop, angle it at will, let the room keep its breath while refusing the lamp's interrogation. Years passed without real drama. Heat waves came and left. I wrote notes to myself on sticky paper and lost them. Then came the night the lamp signaled its own end. There was a pop outside my window. No gentle fade, no apology, just a sudden absence pitched against silence. I was in my chair, facing the folding screen, the room arranged exactly the way you leave a stage after rehearsal, with the lamp dead. Night gathered in and pressed against the glass. An hour later, the rest of the house joined it. The sockets went mute. I sat there in pitch-perfect darkness for a bit. Somewhere in the distance, metal argued with concrete, and someone's generator protested its fate. I found my phone and squinted at the battery. I just had my cell phone with 48% battery. It was enough to pretend I could read. So I tried to lose myself in a cape and a city that can be saved by turning a page. It didn't last. The light picked out my fatigue rather than words. I'm disabled and not too steady on my feet. So I chose stillness over wandering through a house that had become a collection of dark corners. I shut my phone off, put the Superman book on the side table, and just sort of relaxed in the chair. I must have fallen asleep without meaning to. I woke to nothing. No hum from the fridge. No traffic slipping by the cul-de-sac mouth. Not even the familiar halo of that icy street lamp. The power was still off. In that kind of dark, your eyes keep trying to make bargains with shadows. Distance collapses. Time stands very near. The garden was a wall of unseen leaves, and the window a shape I could find only with memory. That's when I heard the faint pressure of something being moved. Fabric on wood, frame against floor. My first thought was clumsy. The screen had tipped. Then instinct argued otherwise, because that sound carried intention. It wasn't a fall, it was a careful displacement. I held my breath and angled my head, and the faintest slider of starlight slipped through a widening seam. I understood, and the understanding arrived without words. Someone had climbed in through my window while I was asleep, and now stood in the narrow corridor between the glass and the folding screen. The moon was a clipped fingernail low in the sky, a meager lamp that knew better than to shine enough. The figure drew the panel back with patience, not the haste of a smash and grab. The room became a maze again, minefields of boxes and books, and the traitorous squeak of chair legs on wood. I sat in my chair like a forgotten statue. My hands were cold, and the cold belonged to fear. My heart was absolutely hammering in my chest as the person stepped free of the screen. They could have a weapon. They seemed thin and of average height, a shadow wrapped in a human outline, head turned, eyes hunting a path through my cluttered world. They touched a side table with their fingers, barely, like a pianist testing the first key. Their foot met a box and slid it a fraction. There was no way I was going to sit there in the dark and wait until they noticed and stabbed me. Theater. I remembered. If my body couldn't win, perhaps my voice could. I didn't stand. I didn't move. I made myself a mouth in the dark. Nothing else. I shaped the words I needed to sound like an animal that owned this territory and had owned it longer than electricity itself, putting on my most terrifying horror creator voice, sitting completely in the dark on my chair. I growled, "Get out before you can't live to regret it." The effect was immediate. The silhouette jolted hard enough to catch a table edge. Somehow, that was the truest sound of the night. Fear. Recognizing fear. The person darted toward the window the same way a hand recoils from heat. The figure jerked and clattered against something and absolutely honed it out of the open window. I rose too quickly for my joints and paid for it, but I reached the glass in time to flash my phone across the pavement. He looked like some kind of older teenager sprinting along the curb. Errand over. Night returned to him. I didn't bother calling the cops or anything. The law would chalk it up to a trespass aborted by fright. A report without a follow-up. Nothing taken. No one hurt. But inside my chest, something had been removed and replaced. The simple trust that a barrier is a barrier because you say so. I secured the window and stood in the new quiet. The screen looked smaller than it had ever been, only fabric stretched thin over assumptions. I've never been more afraid in my life than in that moment when a stranger's hand and my own breathing shared a room that had belonged to me alone. I'm definitely going to be a lot more careful with leaving the window open going forward. But caution is a habit, not an event, and I needed more than a vow. Neighbors woke to the blackout with plastic torches and the chatter that breeds whenever the grid falters. I listened to their footsteps from behind the door, cataloging the number of people trying to make night feel discussable. None of them had a figure crawl through their window. I could have told someone. I could have let the cul-de-sac hum with that kind of drama. Instead, I brewed silence like tea and sat beside it. Morning was an echo of the night, except the light now had the nerve to be cheerful. I checked the sill for scuffs and found a faint trace. A rubber sole had left a smudge on the paint where it met the outside wall. I imagined the timing. The dead street lamp, my private sky, had died, and then the electricity followed. The roaring, bright world collapsed into a pocket universe. He had chosen that pocket. Why my window? It sits low and opens like a mouth. The garden gate is never truly loud. It rides on muscle memory more than metal. And I had been obvious about my habits. Windows open, screen angled, the little rituals of ventilation that spoke of convenience over paranoia. I took inventory. Nothing gone. No drawers rifled. No deliberate search for valuables. It had been the simplest sort of intrusion. Entry, orientation, panic, retreat. If I hadn't woken when I did, would he have found my wallet? Would he have turned on his phone for light? The risk is that curiosity becomes story, and story makes space for sympathy. My mind almost did it. Some boy deciding he was starving for trouble more than for food, trying on bravery he hadn't earned. That nearly softened me. Then I remembered the feel of the room when I realized I wasn't alone. Sympathy flickered and went out. I made lists after breakfast. Locks I could add, sensors for the windows, a small wedge that could sit in the track and refuse to let the pane slide high enough for a human shoulder. I measured the sill and marked the frame. I would keep the night breeze, but I would choose its path. I looked at the folding screen and laughed without sound. This was performance art, not protection. With the council, I tried again. The previous complaints about the lamp's glare had vanished into bureaucracy's soft throat. Perhaps talk of safety would travel farther than talk of sleep. I wrote briefly and insisted plainly. I attached the photo of the smudge on the paint and a picture of the screen that had failed by doing exactly what it was built to do: move easily. I also did something I avoided for years. I phoned a friend. I hate the script that disability demands when the topic is danger. You have to assure people you are careful while not sounding helpless. You end up auditioning for your own life. But I made the call. She insisted on bringing a battery lantern and a door chime that sings whenever it opens. We laughed about the song and left it set to a tone that felt like lowercase letters. Afternoon heat returned as if nothing had happened, as if night were a rumor day merely allows. I sat in my chair again to avoid the tight ache in my knees. The window was cracked only enough to breathe. The screen stood 3 feet farther back than usual, no longer pretending to be a wall. I held the phone and traced the script of last night in my head. What if I hadn't spoken? What if I'd tried to stand? My body is practical but slow. It warns me, and I try to listen. That voice I used, my horror narrator, was the one tool I could wield without rising. The one thing I could make larger than fear. I practiced that voice again, in daylight, hating the melodrama and loving the control. I tried variations: soft threat, flat authority, weary certainty. It felt absurd until I remembered the sound of the figure stumbling back, the unsteady retreat that said my act had landed. The performance had been an instrument, not a joke. When twilight returned, power came with it, filling the house with its small, familiar orchestra. The street lamp remained dead, a mercy I no longer trusted. Darkness had done me one favor and one disservice. It allowed the intruder and ended the glare. I watched the driveway and the hedge and the path as if the absence of sodium light had handed me a cleaner lens. The garden seemed larger, the shrubs more like actors awaiting an entrance. I declined that show. I shut the window before midnight and used the fan's steady wind instead, sometime around 1. I woke sharply, not to a sound, but to the instinct of one. My phone was already in my hand, as if my sleeping brain had loaned my fingers purpose. The screen was off. I held my breath and listened, and nothing answered. Still, I turned the phone face down to keep its light from announcing me, and I waited. It is strange what becomes ritual in a single day. I had acquired a new posture, the alert stillness of a person who knows a border has been tested once, and therefore can be tested twice. Minutes passed, and the only energy in the room was mine. I exhaled and counted 10 more. Then I slept in starts until dawn found a way through cloud and over roofline. No one came. Perhaps the lesson was already over, and this extra readiness was just the cost. Or perhaps the lesson was the readiness itself. Days later, the council replied with olive words: sympathetic, procedural, promising a review of rear shields for the streetlights. I printed the email and pinned it to the corkboard with a calendar note to follow up before the promise cooled. I ordered a set of window restrictors that allow air and refuse shoulders. They arrived with instructions that assumed knees bend like they did at 20. I took my time and fitted them anyway. The click of the last screw settling into the frame felt like a small oath. Nothing final, but nothing flimsy, because fear had arrived where I lived. I walked the rooms like a guest at my own inspection. I noticed habits masquerading as conveniences, the spare key in the ceramic pot shaped like a cat, the extension cord that could best be described as hopeful, the freestanding bookshelf making a ladder of itself beside the sill. I changed more than I expected. By the time evening folded the house in, it looked the same, but behaved differently. Doors snicked into place, and windows argued a little when coaxed beyond their new limits, and I told the story to exactly one more person. My neighbor on the left, the one who kept time and regret in equal proportions in her planters. She is polite to a fault, which means she notices everything and reports nothing unless asked. When I told her, she listened until I finished, and then said only, "I heard running after midnight. I thought it was foxes." I thanked her for the thought and left it at that. The screen remained. It was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with safety. A canvas garden, printed on canvas, too on the nose to be clever. I set it against the wall and used it to hide the vacuum cleaner and the guilt that likes to stand behind practical things. Sometimes I caught myself glancing at it, as if a shadow could echo itself across days. The mind is good at theater. Give it a prop, and it will write a second act. On the Saturday after, a repair crew arrived for the street lamp, all bright vests and inevitable size. They replaced the bulb and, to my surprise, fitted a shield like a modesty panel, forcing the light down and away from my windows. The effect was immediate. The garden bathed rather than burned. I watched from the window with the restrictor set and felt the smallest quiver of reprieve. Night returned with measurable light, and I watched it without flinching. I slept in the bed rather than the chair and placed the phone on the table within reach. Face down. I woke once to my own name said in a dream. The house held still. A week later, curiosity dressed itself as responsibility. I walked to the corner shop and asked the owner, who seems to know when the wind intends rain, whether anyone else had trouble during the blackout. He nodded toward the corkboard, where handwritten notes bloom and wilt. Shed doors, mostly, bins nudged open. Someone's bicycle took a tour. We laughed the way people do when they're laughing at the part they can afford to. I bought batteries I might not need, and chocolate I definitely did. That night, I wrote the words I had said aloud into my notebook. Seeing them in ink made them look sillier than they had sounded. But they had worked. That mattered more than dignity. I underlined them and added a line beneath. Practice the voice, not the fear. The fear practices itself. There is a difference between barricading and preparing. Barricading imagines a siege. Preparing imagines a visit. I chose the second and adjusted the house around that belief. I could not guarantee safety, but I could meet the next test standing inside a plan instead of inside a hope. The window would still open. Air would still move through the room and carry the scent of whatever summer chooses to celebrate. And if someone chose to climb, my mind would not take as long to understand what my ears already knew. The last thing I did before midnight was open the journal and write a sentence I had avoided because it felt like an admission. I am not ashamed of being scared. Fear is a measurement, not a verdict. It tells you how close the edge is, not that you have to leap. When I finally closed the light and lay in the ordinary dark, I tried to count my breathing like stairs. The house responded with the usual small signatures of a structure settling around a human. Expansion, contraction, the tiny groans of materials meeting temperature. I smiled into the pillow because those sounds hadn't changed since before the night and wouldn't change after. They were my house, remembering how to be a house. In the quiet that followed, I pictured the runaway boy and hoped he found a better door to knock on, one that opens for help rather than for theft. That is the only grace I will offer him. The rest I keep for myself, the window that now tells the truth about how far it will open, the voice that, when asked, will rise again from the dark and announce a boundary, and the knowledge that I can live with open air and closed invitations at the same time. If there is a moral, and stories demand one the way gardens demand rain, it is simply this: walls that breathe still need bones, and the dark, for all its shadows, is not the enemy. It only reveals what light allows to gather. Story number 6. I did not believe a machine could hate me until it pronounced my name like a verdict. Threats are loud in movies. In my house, they arrived as a clinical monotone that knew my child's face. Everyone told me to block and move on. The message described the sticker on my daughter's lunchbox. Help came wearing the familiar cologne of my on-again ex, and I mistook comfort for safety. By the time the police traced the metadata, the monster had already held my hand through my worst nights. I'm Katie, and I used to think fear was an event. It isn't. Fear is a residency permit stamped across your days, a bureaucratic occupation of the ordinary. That April night, I lay in bed, thumbing through strangers' vacations, waiting for sleep to pick me up like a reliable taxi. A message request slid onto my screen. The profile looked normal enough. Local. Our ages aligned. Our city in common. And I answered with a polite question. A small attempt at being decent in a place that rarely rewards it. 2 minutes later, it arrived. Not a text, but an audio file. Curiosity felt harmless, so I pressed play. Hello, Katie. The synthetic voice did not rasp or stutter. It recited, calm, almost kind. It told me it had watched me for a long time. It told me it had decided I would die. Then it trespassed where only love belongs. It said my daughter would, too. It told me I would witness it. The words were sterile, the content septic. My body tried to erase itself into the mattress. The voice knew my street. It described our house. It described my child's hair the way a pediatrician does, clinical and precise, naming the school she attended as if reading from enrollment forms. When the audio ended, the room kept talking, radiator, clock, my own pulse carrying a megaphone. I did the math any parent does during danger. Distance to door. Distance to daughter. Distance to help. I called the only person I could imagine arriving faster than panic. Joey. We had been a flickering thing for a year. Me, him, and the space between his best self and the bottle. He could fix a leaky sink, soften a sulk, make my dad laugh. He could also drink until he was a stranger standing in his own shoes. That night, he was just speed and concern. 20 minutes later, he sat on my couch, my phone in his hand, listening in another room, because I couldn't. He returned with a mix of fury and focus. He said we'd go to the police. He promised there were new ways to find people who thought the internet was camouflage. We filed the report. We met a specialist, cyber-stalking detective, who gave me a ritual. Archive everything. Don't block, don't delete, preserve. Save each voice note, every sly account, every number. Meanwhile, the messages behaved like weather that had lost its calendar. I stopped pressing play. Whoever was behind the voice adapted. An unknown number left a voicemail near midnight. I listened for seconds, enough for my stomach to fold into itself. Then I ended the call and ended my composure with it. Joey came again, steady as a piece of furniture you finally notice when the room empties. He soothed my daughter, drove her to school at dawn, and I gave the detective the number as if it were a clue shaped like a key. A few quiet days faked progress. Then midnight arrived with its hands. The front door shuddered in its frame, a percussion made of intent. My daughter was at my mother's for a spell, mercy by calendar, and I felt logic leave like heat from an opened window. I locked my bedroom door and called emergency dispatch. I said the word I had avoided: escalation. The operator stayed with me, a human rope across a dark well, until sirens stitched themselves into the night. The hammering ceased just before the blue lights turned our street into an X-ray. Officers searched, then guided me downstairs. The door wore no bruises, as if terror had learned subtlety for court. The detective recommended I stay elsewhere. My mother made up the spare bed, tucking courage into hospital corners. For a while, we performed normal. Breakfasts, cartoons, shoes by the mat. When I returned home for clothes, I found a single page pinned to the fridge, the heart of the house. I see you. A printed smiley, cheerful as a bruise. It was not a loud act. It was a thesis. It declared my kitchen a stage and my life a matinee. Joey offered his place. I said no for my child's sake, but let him orbit us. He tightened screws, replaced a weak latch, parked in my driveway, like a guard. We drifted toward the idea of us again, and I mistook proximity for safety. Then the detective called with a phrase that makes the body hold its breath. Good news and bad news. Good first. There was a lead. A set of images used to bait me hadn't been stripped of their metadata. The birthplaces of the files still whispered coordinates. From there, a thread. At the end of it, a door. She came to my mother's and sat at the table where report cards once lived. She said the sentence with a careful mouth. The person stalking you is your friend Joey. I insisted she had misfiled the universe. She repeated the evidence. The Insta profile seeded from his device. The routing of the voice notes through services attached to his identifiers. A timeline that read like a diary. Later, they showed me his recorded confession. He explained motive, like a florist explaining thorns. He did it so she'd need me. The magistrate signed an emergency restraining order. Paper suddenly felt like steel. I would love to write that a gavel closed the season neatly. Reality is less ceremonial. Fear lingers like a perfume in drapes you've already washed twice. I learned the theology of boundaries, deadbolts, cameras, neighbors' numbers in favorites. I learned to keep a ledger, time, usernames, the tiny changes a watcher mistakes for invisibility. My daughter learned new language, safe word, plan B, trusted adult. We also learned to keep delight alive, to buy the bright cereal sometimes, to dance in the kitchen that had once been a bulletin board for someone else's script. Months later, after the whispers and the hearings, Joey left town. People said he moved across the country. People say things. What I know is that my front door sounds like a front door again. And when the phone rings after midnight, I let it roll into a digital pit I do not climb down to retrieve. Survival is not triumph. It is stewardship over an ordinary day until it becomes ordinary again. There's a version of me still sitting in that April bedroom, listening to a voice narrate my ending. I visit her sometimes. I tell her she was not naive, only generous. I tell her the first rule of safety is that it should not look like a person you have to manage. I keep the detective's card in my wallet, not because I need it, but because I like the weight of my own choices there. If you are reading this in bed, if a message request flickers at the edge of your screen, hear my voice instead of his. Save everything. Believe yourself and understand the difference between comfort and safety. One pours tea. The other holds the line. Hello, Katie. I've been watching you. I've decided you have to die. Your daughter needs to die, too. Enjoy your final days. I see you. Cyber-stalking detective? Voice note? Emergency restraining order? Elementary school? House? The person stalking you is your friend, Joey. Story number 7. Insurance sells certainty. The year I joined, I learned how quickly certainty files a claim. My promotion letter arrived the same week a tower learned it had bones. I thought risk was a spreadsheet. Then I saw the city from a scaffold and understood height has its own arithmetic. The policy that made my bonus also wrote a ghost into my calendar. My name is Bradley, and 2008 taught me that profit and afterlife sometimes share a folder. I was 20-something, well paid for a junior desk, and greedy for the version of London that never sleeps. Birmingham by day, trains by evening, restaurants that confused my palate into happiness. My firm insured the muscles of the city. Concrete mixers, cranes, men in bright vests who ate under bridges and built skylines above them. The first file that made me feel important was a construction project everyone called the Tower. The paperwork gave it a colder name, but reputations don't care about legal headers. During the kickoff call, I spoke in numbers and clauses. Outside the window, the city stretched like a ledger waiting to be signed. The site visit felt like theater. I wore a hard hat like a borrowed crown and followed a safety officer across temporary floors that flexed under promise. He joked that insurance people only look up, never down. I looked down anyway and saw the street turned miniature, which is how youth reads danger. Charming, because it is far. A foreman with concrete under his nails told me the night shift had reported a presence. Not noise from machines, not complaints from tenants. Just the feeling of being counted by something with perfect attendance. I wrote worker fatigue in my notes and recommended extra lighting, the ritual way to appease doubt. A week later, a subcontractor slipped. The harness did its grim arithmetic, and he lived, shaken, bruised, evangelical about what he'd stepped around. Cameras showed only him and a smear where a person might be, if cameras believed rumors. Our risk committee convened. We added a clause that moved nothing on site, but shifted everything on the balance sheet. I initialed it. My bonus learned a new digit. That was when the tower began sending me correspondence in a different language. In dreams, I climbed to a floor with no number, found an office that mirrored mine, except my chair faced a window cut into empty sky. On the glass, written as if by a fingertip dipped in rain, someone had left a message. I see you. I woke amused at my own melodrama. In the morning, I added psych factors to a checklist and felt thorough. 2 months after completion, hairline cracks appeared like faint handwriting in the concrete. Engineers argued with time, lawyers rehearsed. The building opened anyway. In the lobby incident log, a tenant noted a midnight call from a number that didn't exist, a voice that sounded like a machine reading a verdict. I filed it as a telecommunications glitch. That night, on a late train, my phone woke with a withheld number. I let it roll to voicemail. The message addressed me by name. Hello, Bradley. The cadence was flat as a ruled page. It detailed the tower, our contractor, and a line from the exclusion I had written myself. It ended with office politeness. Enjoy your final days. I tried to starve it of attention. The tower answered by making itself a rumor in my life. Elevators taking instruction from empty air. Maintenance lights pulsing in a rhythm that looked deliberate. A security guard confessed he carried a small radio now because silence made him think there was a second city layered over ours. He didn't answer unknown numbers anymore. I told him that was sensible risk management and pretended that phrase was a shelter. Here is what I believe. Now, you don't need ghosts for a haunting. A policy can follow you as faithfully as any specter, especially when you authored the condition that let something step sideways through a door no one else saw. I still live in insurance. I still believe in numbers, but I also believe that certain buildings remember the names of the people who tried to price them. And some nights, the tower leans very slightly, as if to hear whether I will finally pick up. Hello, Bradley. I see you. Enjoy your final days.